The ink on the merger agreement was still wet, which was fortunate, because the blood spattered across the mahogany conference table was drying fast. I didn't care that the Obsidian Pack's security detail had just been eviscerated by a rogue faction. I cared that my billable hours were being wasted on amateur theatrics. I stepped over a groaning guard, the treaty held high above the carnage. The problem wasn't the violence. The problem was Clause 14b. The signature required a witness biologically bonded to the Alpha King, a Luna, which Silas didn't have. He looked at me, eyes flashing gold, and made a proposal that defied every labor law in existence. "Fake the bond," he said. "Be my Luna for 90 days. We sign, you get paid, and I get my treaty." I should have walked out. Instead, I uncapped my pen. They call me the Wolf Whisperer in the underground corporate circles. I detest the title. It implies I have some mystical connection to these creatures, or that I soothe their savage beasts. I don't. I simply understand that lycanthropy is just another variable in high-stakes risk management. Most negotiators bring silver bullets to a meeting with a werewolf. I bring ironclad non-disclosure agreements and a forensic accountant's eye for weakness. My portfolio isn't built on kills. It's built on compliance. When an Alpha King can't stop his pack from shredding the local economy, they call me to restructure the hierarchy. The client this time was the Obsidian Pack. On paper, they were a military superpower, holding territory that spanned 3 mountain ranges and controlled critical mineral rights. In reality, they were insolvent. Their previous leadership had spent decades focusing on territorial expansion while neglecting basic supply chain logistics. They were asset-rich, cash-poor, and desperate for a trade deal that would see them through the winter. That desperation was my leverage. I wasn't there to offer charity. I was there to facilitate a merger that would save them from their own incompetence. I arrived at the headquarters precisely at 900 hours. The building was a monolith of black glass and steel, designed to intimidate. It didn't work. I checked in with a receptionist who looked like she was vibrating with anxiety, a common side effect of working too close to high-level predatory pheromones. She told me the Alpha King, Silas, was detained in a strategy meeting and would be with me shortly. Shortly is a relative term. In my contract, it is a billable term. I sat in the waiting area, a space decorated with minimalist furniture that looked uncomfortable and cost more than my car. I didn't fidget. I didn't scroll through my phone. I opened the billing app on my tablet and started a timer. Every minute Silas kept me waiting was a penalty fee added to the final invoice. It wasn't pettiness. It was a calibration of the power dynamic. If I let him waste my time now, he would assume he could waste my expertise later. At the 15-minute mark, the receptionist offered me water. I declined. I was busy calculating the surcharge. The air in the waiting room was thick, heavy with a scent that bypassed the olfactory bulb and hit the hindbrain directly. It smelled like ozone, wet earth, and something metallic, the biological signature of a pack that ran on violence rather than caffeine. It was designed to trigger a flight response in humans. I simply noted it as an environmental hazard and adjusted my hourly rate accordingly. Most consultants would be sweating. The stories about Alpha Silas were legendary, a warlord who took the throne by tearing the throat out of his predecessor. They said he was a brute, a monster, a creature of pure instinct. I didn't put stock in rumors. Rumors were inefficient. I looked at the financial reports on my screen. A brute didn't diversify his portfolio into renewable energy sectors, which the Obsidian Pack had quietly done last quarter. A monster didn't hire a human consultant to negotiate a treaty. At 20 minutes past the hour, the double doors at the end of the hall swung open. No apology, no rushing assistant, just a sudden drop in the room's air pressure. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I expected a warlord. What I got was something far more dangerous. I walked toward the office, not as a guest, but as an auditor entering a failing department. The waiting game was over. It was time to see if the king could handle the math. The office of the Alpha King was a study in controlled aggression. It wasn't the cave of a barbarian, but the command center of a CEO who happened to have a resting heart rate of 40 and the ability to bench press a sedan. The walls were lined with tactical maps, not pelts. The desk was a slab of reclaimed obsidian, polished to a mirror shine, devoid of clutter save for a single tablet and a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. And behind it sat the variable I hadn't accounted for. Silas didn't loom. Looming is a theatrical tactic used by middle managers and insecure pack leaders to artificially inflate their presence. Silas simply occupied space with the gravitational density of a collapsed star. He didn't look up as I entered. He was reading a digital report, his scrolling speed suggesting a cognitive processing rate well above the human average. He wasn't wearing the ceremonial furs the tabloids love to feature. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that was tailored within an inch of its life, the fabric struggling to contain the sheer mass of his shoulders. "You're billing me for the weight," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice didn't growl. It was a sub-bass frequency that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in the sternum. It was a voice designed to command compliance on a biological level. I didn't pause. I walked to the guest chair, placed my briefcase on the desk with a deliberate thud, and sat down. "Standard retention protocol, Your Majesty. My time is a finite resource. Your schedule is a management issue, not my financial liability. The surcharge has already been applied." He finally looked up. His eyes were the color of liquid gold, the pupils slitted vertically in a way that should have been terrifying. I noted the physiological anomaly and filed it away as irrelevant data. He wasn't angry. The corner of his mouth twitched, a micro-expression of amusement. "Ruthless," he murmured, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. My generals could learn from that. "Your generals are the reason I'm here," I corrected, unlocking my tablet. "I've reviewed the preliminary merger terms. They're sentimental garbage. You're trying to negotiate a territorial expansion based on historical pack lands. That's emotional leveraging. The Silver Pack doesn't care about your ancestors' hunting grounds. They care about the northern mineral deposits." I spun the tablet around to face him. "I've redrafted the proposal. We're not asking for land. We're asking for exclusive transit rights through the Shadow Pass." Silas leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking under the strain. He scanned the data, his brow furrowing. "The pass is narrow, strategically negligible." "The pass is the only winter-viable supply route for their grain imports," I countered, tapping the screen. "You control the pass, you control their food supply. You don't need to conquer them, Silas. You just need to be the one holding the keys to their pantry. It's a leverage play, not a dominance play." The silence that followed was heavy. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, the ozone scent spiking sharply. This was the moment where most humans broke. I was correcting a creature who had killed challengers for less. I kept my breathing rhythmic, my heart rate steady. I wasn't challenging his alpha status. I was auditing his logic. There is a distinction, and his intelligence was sharp enough to recognize it. He stood up. The movement was fluid, terrifyingly silent for a man of his size. He walked around the desk, not toward the door, but toward me. He stopped inches from my chair, invading my personal space with the subtlety of a landslide. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a furnace fueled by a metabolic rate that burned through calories like jet fuel. "You speak of starvation tactics with a very steady pulse, Ms. Mercer," he said softly, leaning down until his face was level with mine. He inhaled deeply, openly scenting me. It was a violation of professional boundaries so egregious it would have triggered an immediate HR lawsuit in the human world. Here, it was a lie detector test. I didn't lean back. I held his gaze, analyzing the gold flecks in his irises. "I speak of survival logistics. Starvation is a variable. My pulse is steady because I know you need this treaty signed more than you need to intimidate a consultant." "True," he conceded, straightening up. The predator retreated, replaced instantly by the executive. "But there is a flaw in your transit rights strategy." "There isn't," I said, confident in my math. "Not the math," he said, walking back to his window to look out over the city that was slowly bankrupting him. "The law. The ancient accords govern the Shadow Pass. To hold rights to it, the signatory must represent a complete leadership unit, a dyad." I scrolled down to the bottom of the document, to the fine print I had flagged earlier but hoped to bypass with a loophole. Clause 14b. "The Luna Clause," I said, the taste of the words bitter. "The signatory must be bonded." I am unmated, Silas said, his back to me. And the Silver Alpha knows it. He won't sign the transit rights over to a lone wolf. He considers it unstable. He turned back, his expression unreadable. My biology is blocking your brilliant logistics, Ms. Mercer. I stared at Clause 14b. In the human corporate world, this specific requirement would be grounds for a discrimination lawsuit and an immediate HR tribunal. In the supernatural sector, it was just Tuesday. The implications were binary. Either we secured a Luna, or the deal died, taking the Obsidian Pack's solvency with it. You need a Luna, I stated, keeping my voice clinically neutral. And you have 24 hours before the Silver Alpha arrives. Unless you have a secret fiancé stashed in a kennel somewhere, the transit rights are dead. Silas swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the movement hypnotic. I do not have a mate. I have a kingdom to run. Mates are distracting variables. They introduce emotional volatility into a system that requires absolute order. Then we restructure the deal without the pass. No, he said, the word dropping like a gavel. We change the variable. We provide the signatory. He looked at me. It wasn't a look of longing. It was the look a predator gives a particularly interesting puzzle box he intends to solve. You, he said. I blinked, processing the data. Me? I'm human. I don't howl at the moon, and I certainly don't submit to authority figures with fur. Exactly, Silas said, setting the glass down with a sharp click. I don't need a breeding partner, Ms. Mercer. I need a political shield. Someone who can stand in a ring with the Silver Alpha and not flinch. You just proved you can do that. You dismantled my strategy without raising your heart rate. That is the energy I need at the table. He outlined the proposal with the same detachment he used for troop deployments. A 90-day engagement, purely performative. A contract marriage in everything but the legal binding. I would play the role of the chosen mate, the human who tamed the beast, giving the Obsidian Pack the appearance of stability. In exchange, the treaty gets signed and the pack survives the winter. It's fraud, I pointed out. It's a loophole, he corrected. The accords require a bonded witness. They do not specify that the bond must be destined by fate. They only require the biological marker. I sat back, tapping my stylus against my chin. A fake engagement. It was insane. It was dangerous. And it was the only way to close this deal. My reputation was built on closing the unclosable. If I pulled this off, my consulting fee would skyrocket into the 7 figures. I have conditions, I said, opening a new file on my tablet labeled Project Luna. Name them. 1, I typed, projecting the screen onto his desk surface. Hazard pay. Triple my hourly rate for every hour I am in character. 2, a severance package that includes a full security detail for 1 year post-contract, in case your enemies decide to target the ex-fiancé. 3, absolute autonomy. I do not curtsy, I do not fetch, and I do not participate in any ritual that involves raw meat. And 4, a wardrobe budget. If I'm playing a queen, I'm not doing it in off-the-rack polyester. Silas read the terms, a smirk touching his lips. Agreed, but there is a technical requirement you cannot negotiate. He stood up and walked around the desk again. This time, the air in the room didn't just get heavy, it got hot. The bond, he said, stopping by my chair. To fool the Silver Alpha, you must smell like me. Not just surface contact or pheromone sprays, deep tissue scent marking. I paused, my fingers hovering over the tablet. You mean the bite? A nip, he corrected, on the pulse point. It deposits a specific enzyme into your bloodstream. It mimics the mating bond for approximately 3 months before fading. Without it, the deception fails in 5 seconds. I looked at my wrist, the radial artery, a vulnerable point. To let an alpha put his teeth there was an act of supreme submission, or, in this case, a necessary system integration. It's a temporary tattoo, I told myself aloud, a biological stamp of approval. Precisely, Silas said, extending his hand. Do we have a deal, Ms. Mercer? I looked at the potential profit margin. I looked at the treaty that would save thousands of jobs. I sighed, rolled up my sleeve, and offered him my arm. "Make it quick," I said. "I have a conference call at 11. Silas took my wrist. His grip was iron, his skin burning against mine. He didn't hesitate. He lifted my arm to his mouth, his eyes locking onto mine, gold burning into brown. Then he bit down. The pain was sharp, sudden, and clinical, like a large gauge needle entering a vein. But then came the heat. It rushed up my arm, a liquid fire that raced toward my heart. It wasn't romantic. It was invasive. It felt like my blood was being rewritten, my very chemistry adjusted to accommodate a foreign admin access. He pulled back, licking a drop of crimson from the puncture wound. The wound was already closing, sealed by his saliva. "Done," he said, his voice rougher now. I pulled my arm back, inspecting the mark. It was a jagged scar, throbbing in time with my heartbeat. I felt different, tethered. "Contract active," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I signed the pad with my uninjured hand. "Now, let's go lie to the neighbors." The debut of the Happy Couple was scheduled for the Winter Solstice Gala, an event that combined the social pressure of a royal wedding with the security risks of a G20 summit. I treated my preparation like a pre-flight checklist. The gown was midnight blue silk, chosen not for its aesthetic appeal, but because the heavy drape of the skirt concealed a thigh holster holding a compact taser. My heels were reinforced steel shanks, fashionable, yet capable of puncturing a metatarsal if negotiations turned physical. The most critical accessory, however, was the diamond cuff on my left wrist. It was designed to draw the eye, framing the bite marks Silas had left there. The skin was still angry, the bruise a vivid violet against the expensive jewelry. To the room, it was a claim. To me, it was a receipt. Silas met me at the bottom of the grand staircase. He was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than the average pack member's annual salary. The tailoring was exquisite, struggling valiantly to civilize a man who looked like he would prefer to be tearing things apart with his teeth. He offered me his arm. It wasn't a gentlemanly gesture. It was a tactical linkage, a locking of mechanisms. "Smile," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against my rib cage. "You look like you're auditing their tax returns." "I am," I replied, taking his arm and stepping into the light. The alpha of the Onyx clan is wearing a watch that suggests he's embezzling from his infrastructure fund. And the woman in red by the bar is carrying a clutch too heavy to be just lipstick. I'd wager a Glock 26. We entered the ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasting meat, and suppressed aggression. Hundreds of eyes turned toward us. I felt the weight of their scrutiny, predators assessing the new variable in the ecosystem. I didn't shrink. I projected the specific brand of boredom that only the very powerful or the very foolish can afford. I let them see the mark on my wrist, the biological flag that said I was property, while my posture said I was the CEO. "Dance with me," Silas commanded. It wasn't a request. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, a rhythm that felt deceptively civilized. We moved to the floor. Silas placed a hand on my waist. His grip was firm, possessive. He attempted to lead with the force of a freight train. I resisted, adjusting my frame to maintain my center of gravity. "You're fighting me," he whispered, his lips brushing my ear. To the crowd, it looked like a lover's secret. To me, it was a performance review. "You're driving, not leading," I corrected, shifting my weight to force him to turn on my axis. "If you pull me off balance, I look weak. If I look weak, the Silver Alpha sees an opening. Relax your shoulder. You're broadcasting tension." "I am tense," he growled, though he adjusted his hold, allowing me to dictate the spacing. "There are 3 potential assassins in the room." "4," I said, spinning out from him and returning smoothly to his arms, catching the reflection of the room in a mirrored pillar. "You missed the waiter with the scar on his neck. He's been tracking your carotid artery for the last 5 minutes. Silas looked at me, a flash of genuine surprise in his golden eyes. The friction between us wasn't romantic. It was the spark of 2 high-functioning systems colliding. The crowd watched us, interpreting our whispered tactical updates and physical struggle for dominance as intense, burning passion. They saw a king and his Luna, overwhelmed by instinct. I saw a client who desperately needed to improve his situational awareness. "You are terrifyingly competent," he said, and for the first time, the admiration in his voice wasn't an act. "I'm expensive," I reminded him, tightening my grip on his shoulder as we turned. "Don't forget the overtime." We held the pose as the music faded, the illusion of unity perfect. The applause started, a polite ripple that masked the underlying tension. I scanned the perimeter, my adrenaline spiking not from the romance, but from the threat assessment. Then, across the room, the waiter with the scar dropped a tray of champagne flutes. The crash of shattering crystal wasn't an accident. It was a starting gun. The shattering of crystal was the auditory cue for chaos. In a human boardroom, a dropped glass usually signals a fired intern. In a supernatural gala, it signals that the perimeter has been breached. Before the shards even hit the floor, Silas moved. He didn't communicate, he reacted. He seized my arm and shoved me behind his bulk, effectively turning himself into a meat shield. It was a noble, chivalrous, and tactically imbecilic maneuver. By placing his mask directly in my line of sight, he blocked my situational awareness and reduced my utility to 0. "Stay down," he roared, his voice dropping into that command frequency that usually makes wolves roll over and expose their throats. I did not stay down. I stepped to the left, using his tuxedo-clad back as cover while I assessed the threat matrix. 3 assailants, standard triangular formation. They weren't assassins, they were stress testers. Low-level enforcers sent to see if the new Luna would break under pressure. Silas engaged the first 2 with a brutality that was efficient but messy. He was all instinct, tearing through their defenses with terrifying speed. But his focus was too narrow. He missed the variable on the periphery. The third attacker, the waiter I had flagged, lunged. He saw a woman in a silk gown and assumed soft target. He expected a scream. He expected me to cower. He did not expect me to lift the hem of my midnight blue dress and draw the X-26 tactical taser strapped to my thigh. I didn't panic. I didn't hesitate. I aimed for the center of mass. "Clear," I whispered to no one. I pulled the trigger. The probes deployed, hitting him in the chest and the thigh, completing the circuit. 50,000 volts of neuromuscular incapacitation overrode his nervous system. He dropped like a sack of wet cement, twitching on the marble floor. I stepped over him, keeping the weapon trained on his spasms. "Assault with a deadly weapon," I announced, my voice cutting through the din. "And violation of the venue's noise ordinance. Also, wearing brown shoes with a black tuxedo? Unforgivable negligence." Silas finished his work, a shattered arm, a dislocated jaw, and spun around, eyes wild, chest heaving. He expected to find a corpse or a crying woman. He found me reholstering my weapon and checking my pulse rate on my smartwatch. "Clear," I said to him. "Let's move. The extraction team is 2 minutes out, which is unacceptable." He stared at me. For a second, the wolf was confused. Then he grabbed me, dragging me through the kitchen exit and into the waiting armored SUV. The door sealed us in, cutting off the noise, but the pressure inside the cabin spiked. "You engaged," he snarled, looming over me in the confined space. "I gave you a direct order to stay down." "You blocked my field of fire," I countered, unbuckling my steel-shanked heels and tossing them to the floor. "You treated me like cargo. Cargo gets stolen, Silas. Assets defend themselves." "You are not an asset," he was yelling now, the sound vibrating in the reinforced glass. "You are the target. If you die, the treaty dies. My duty is to shield you." "If I had stayed behind you, the third man would have put a serrated blade in my kidney while you were busy posturing with the other 2, I snapped back, meeting his gold gaze with cold, brown logic. "I calculated the trajectory. Your defensive perimeter had a 30-degree blind spot. I filled it. That is what a partner does." The word partner hit him harder than the ambush. He froze. His chest was still heaving, the adrenaline of the fight warring with the cognitive dissonance of the moment. I could feel the mark on my wrist throbbing, a biological feedback loop responding to his elevated cortisol levels. It was distracting. I rubbed the spot, frowning at the inefficiency of shared emotions. He looked at the taser sitting on the leather seat between us. Then he looked at me. The dynamic in the car shifted. The suffocating weight of the protector vanished, replaced by the sharp electric tension of two apex predators acknowledging each other. He realized then that he hadn't brought a pet into his home. He had brought a weapon. "You carry a taser in a Vera Wang gown," he said softly. It sounded like an accusation, but it felt like a revelation. "I carry a taser everywhere," I corrected, opening my laptop to start the incident report. "Because men like you think muscles are a substitute for strategy. Now drive. We have damage control to manage." The penthouse was less a residential space and more a high-altitude bunker with better thread counts. Silas insisted on the shared living arrangement, citing security necessity after the gala incident. I called it a gross violation of work-life balance, but the contract was ironclad. We were cohabiting. The space was vast, floor-to-ceiling glass, minimalist Italian furniture, and enough open space to land a helicopter. Yet with two apex personalities occupying it, the square footage felt suffocatingly small. The primary issue wasn't the roommate. It was the network interference. The bite mark on my wrist had evolved from a wound into a subdermal transceiver. It was a biological Wi-Fi connection I couldn't disable. I could feel him. Not in a poetic, romantic sense, but as a raw, invasive data stream. If his adrenaline spiked, my pulse echoed the rhythm. If he was agitated, a low-frequency hum started at the base of my skull, making focus impossible. It was like trying to draft a legal brief while standing next to a running generator. Sleep became a tactical negotiation. I slept with a ceramic knife under my pillow, professional habit, while Silas paced the main living area. I could hear the rhythmic click of his claws on the hardwood, a patrol pattern that never varied. My logical brain identified him as a lethal variable in my immediate vicinity. My rewritten blood chemistry, however, interpreted the sound as perimeter secure. I hated the biological betrayal. It made me complacent. I woke at 0400 hours, not because of an alarm, but because the pacing stopped. The sudden silence was a red flag. I found him on the balcony, shirtless, staring out at the city grid. The bond hummed with a brooding intensity that made the air taste like ozone. I didn't offer a blanket or a sympathetic ear. I walked to the espresso machine, pulled 2 shots of dark roast, and carried one out to him. "Your cortisol levels are impacting my REM cycle," I stated, extending the cup. He took it, his fingers brushing mine. The contact sent a jolt of static through the bond that nearly made me drop the porcelain. He didn't pull away. He watched me over the rim of the cup, his eyes tracking the movement of the pulse in my neck with predatory fascination. "You smell like sleep," he observed. "It's disarming." "I smell like expensive moisturizer and fatigue," I corrected, stepping back to reestablish a professional perimeter. "Drink the coffee. We have a board meeting at 800. The morning briefing shifted the dynamic from domestic standoff to corporate warfare. Silas was detained by the security fallout, interrogating the gala security detail in the basement levels. That left the weekly council meeting exposed. Protocol dictated cancellation. I dictated a hostile takeover. I entered the boardroom at 0800 sharp. I was wearing a slate gray power suit tailored to intimidate, my hair pulled back in a severe knot. The council of elders, 6 men who looked like they wrestled bears for cardio, fell silent. They expected the alpha. They got the consultant. "The king is detained on security matters," I announced, bypassing the guest chair and taking the seat at the head of the table. I didn't ask for permission. I assumed the asset was mine to manage. I am acting as proxy. Agenda item 1, the quarterly audit. Marcus, the second in command, leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. "This is pack business, darling, not a place for the human pet to play house." The room tittered. It was a test. I didn't blink. I connected my tablet to the room's main display, projecting a spreadsheet of their last quarter's losses onto the wall in high definition. "This is a financial insolvency hearing, Marcus. And considering the pack is currently bleeding capital through 3 separate shell companies in the Cayman Islands, I'd say you need a pet who can do math. Unless you prefer to explain to Silas why his war chest is empty?" The silence that followed was absolute. The threat of Silas was a blunt instrument. The threat of exposure was a scalpel. I utilized the Luna status not for respect, but for administrative clearance. I pulled the ledgers. The numbers were messy, intentionally obfuscated to hide the bleed. I drilled down into the logistics budget. Supply chains for the western border were overbilling by 40%. Ghost employees on the payroll. It wasn't just incompetence, it was systematic embezzlement. I flagged the transactions, tracing the digital footprint. The authorization codes didn't match Silas's encryption key. They matched the terminal of the man sitting 3 seats to my left. I kept my face blank, the mask of the board auditor firmly in place, but under the table, my hand went to my wrist, tapping the bond. I found the glitch. I didn't confront Marcus in the boardroom. That would have been theatrical, and theatrics are non-billable. Instead, I followed the money. The digital trail led away from the sterile safety of the corporate headquarters and into the North Sector, a development zone listed on the books as a primary infrastructure project, but which the satellite imaging revealed to be a graveyard of rusted beams and poured concrete. I needed physical confirmation of the asset stripping before I could present the case for treason. I requisitioned a site vehicle, logged my itinerary with the central server to ensure a digital footprint, and drove out to the coordinates. The construction site was a monument to negligence. Half-finished skeletal towers of steel jutted into the gray sky, surrounded by silence where there should have been the roar of machinery. I grabbed my tablet and the hard drive I used for off-site backups, stepping out into the mud. I wasn't there to inspect the view. I was there to download the local server logs from the site office, the only place where the raw material invoices would be stored locally, bypassing the main system scrubbers. I found the server room in a portable cabin near the foundation of the main tower. The download was at 80% when the door opened. It wasn't the wind. Marcus stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. He had rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that were thick with muscle and scar tissue. He didn't look like a CFO cooking the books. He looked like an executioner who had finally clocked in. "You're thorough," he said, stepping inside and closing the door. The lock clicked with a finality that suggested my exit interview was about to begin. Most humans would have been content with the credit card limits and the jewelry. "I prefer equity," I replied, not looking up from the progress bar, 90%. "And I don't like it when my client is being bled dry by middle management incompetence. You're not just stealing, Marcus. You're doing it sloppily. The shell companies are all registered to the same P.O. box in Estonia. It's amateur hour." "It's funding for the rebellion," he corrected, his voice deepening, the edges fraying into a growl. "Silas is weak. He brings a human into the inner circle. He negotiates with the Silver Pack instead of crushing them. We need a king, not a CEO." "You need a logistics manager," I said, pulling the drive as the download hit 100%. "Because you can't fund a war if you bankrupt the war chest before the first shot is fired." I pocketed the drive and turned to face him. The air in the cabin shifted. The ozone smell spiked, the precursor to a shift. He wasn't going to debate me. He was going to erase the variable. "Nothing personal, darling," he said, his eyes bleeding into a violent, unnatural yellow. "Just taking out the trash." He lunged. I didn't scream. I didn't freeze. I calculated. A werewolf in close quarters has the advantage of strength and speed, but the disadvantage of momentum. He committed fully to the strike, expecting me to be stationary. I wasn't. I dropped to the floor, sliding under his guard, and kicked the heavy steel desk upward. It didn't hurt him. He was made of granite and rage, but it put an obstacle between us. I scrambled out the back window, hitting the mud and moving toward the unfinished tower. I didn't run in a straight line. That triggers the predator's chase instinct. I moved in jagged, unpredictable angles, heading for the verticality of the scaffolding. Marcus burst through the cabin wall, literally through it, roaring in a way that shook the fillings in my teeth. He was fast, covering the ground in bounding leaps. I hit the first ladder of the scaffolding and climbed. My breath burned in my lungs, but my mind was cold. I needed a force multiplier. I reached the third platform, 30 feet up. Below me, Marcus slammed into the support beams, shaking the entire structure. He was trying to rattle me off like a loose shingle. I scanned the environment. To my left, a suspended pallet of cement bags, hanging from a rusted chain winch. Weight, approximately 2 tons. Position, directly above the primary support strut Marcus was currently assaulting. "Come down, little human," he bellowed, tearing a metal pipe from the bracing as if it were a straw. I didn't answer. I pulled the release lever on the winch. Gravity is the only law that applies equally to alphas and consultants. The pallet dropped. It didn't hit him directly. He was too fast for that. But it smashed into the mud with the force of a meteorite, shattering the foundation he was standing on and sending a shockwave of debris outward. The scaffolding groaned and buckled. I braced myself, but the laws of physics demanded a toll. The platform beneath me tilted violently. I slid, slamming my side against a steel crossbeam before arresting my fall. The crack was audible. A sharp, white-hot line of agony traced my ribcage. Broken, not bruised. Breathing became a manual labor. Below, Marcus was buried under a chaotic mess of wet cement and rebar. He wasn't dead. It takes more than a few tons of concrete to kill a high-ranking wolf. But he was pinned. His roar of frustration was muffled, trapped. I didn't stay to gloat. I forced my body to move, sliding down the emergency chute to the far side of the site. I limped to the tree line, clutching the hard drive like it was a holy relic. My car was compromised. He would have tagged it. I needed extraction. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from shock. I dialed the one number that bypassed all filters. It rang once. "Mercer," Silas's voice answered. He sounded bored, likely in the middle of interrogation. "I have the audit results," I said, my voice tight, wheezing slightly on the inhale. "And a broken rib. Requesting immediate extraction from the North Sector site. Bring a shovel. Your VP of Finance is currently part of the Foundation." The extraction protocol was executed with zero inefficiency. Silas didn't send a team. He was the team. He arrived at the perimeter of the construction site in a vehicle that looked less like a luxury SUV and more like an armored personnel carrier with leather seats. He didn't ask if I could walk. He assessed the angle of my posture, calculated the probability of a rib fracture, and simply lifted me off the ground. I didn't protest. My breath was hitching in short, shallow gasps, and the logical part of my brain acknowledged that bipedal locomotion was currently an inefficient use of energy. The drive was silent, the air inside the cabin pressurized by his suppressed violence. We didn't return to the penthouse. We went to a safe house in the industrial district, a converted loft that smelled of antiseptic, gun oil, and cold steel. It was a sterile box, scrubbed clean of personality, designed for triage rather than comfort. He placed me on a stainless steel examination table. The metal was freezing against my back, a sharp contrast to the furnace heat radiating from him. He didn't call for a medic. He grabbed a pair of trauma shears from a wall-mounted kit and approached me. "Hold still," he commanded. He wasn't the king now. He was a field medic. He cut the silk blouse away without asking. I cataloged the loss of the garment. Italian silk, $400, and mentally added it to the running tab of damages. "The hard drive," I gritted out as he pressed down on my ribcage to assess the damage. "In the pocket. Don't lose it. It proves Marcus was buying loyalty with your money. He was funneling $3 million a quarter into a rebellion fund." "I have the drive," Silas said, tossing the ruined shirt onto a chair. "Breathe." "I can't," I snapped, wincing. "That is the nature of a broken rib, Silas. The mechanics of respiration are compromised." "Shallow breaths," he instructed, his voice low and steady. "Fracture of the 7th rib. Clean break. No puncture to the lung. You were lucky." He applied a gel that smelled of menthol and crushed herbs, something alchemical that stung before it numbed, and began winding a compression bandage around my torso. His hands were large, rough, and surprisingly gentle. "You engaged a Class 5 Alpha in hand-to-hand combat," he said, the words tight. That was statistically unwise. "I engaged a structural weakness in a scaffolding unit," I corrected, watching his face. His jaw was set hard, a muscle ticking in his cheek. "Marcus was just collateral damage to gravity. I assume you're going to handle the cleanup?" Marcus is being excavated as we speak, Silas said, his voice flat. He will face the council in chains. You gave me the paper trail I needed to execute him legally. Before this, he was a political rival. Now, he is an embezzler and a traitor. The pack does not forgive theft. He finished the binding and secured the clip, but he didn't step away. His hands lingered on my waist, his thumbs resting against the curve of my hip. The bond on my wrist flared. It wasn't a spark. It was a steady, resonant hum that seemed to synchronize our heart rates. I felt his rage, cold, sharp, and controlled, and beneath it, a profound sense of relief.
You should be unstable, I observed, analyzing the data coming through the biological link. Your second just tried to kill your mate, even a fake one. Your aggression levels should be redlining. You should be tearing the city apart.
They aren't, he admitted, looking down at me. The gold in his eyes was steady, not swirling with the usual chaotic storm. That is the variable I did not anticipate. Since the bite, the noise is gone. The constant, low-level static of the wolf demanding violence, it is silent. I can think, Sloan. For the first time in years, I am not fighting my own nature. He leaned in, bracing his hands on the table on either side of me, trapping me in his space. You categorize everything. You manage chaos. My biology is responding to your order. You are not just a signatory on a treaty. You are a governor on an engine that was running too hot. I swallowed, my throat dry. This was a breach of contract. We had negotiated hazard pay and wardrobe budgets. We had not negotiated him looking at me as if I were the anchor to his sanity. That is a temporary effect of the enzyme, I said, trying to retreat into science. It will fade in 88 days. Will it? He asked. He finally pulled back, the distance between us feeling like a physical vacuum. Rest. The silver alpha arrives tomorrow. And now that I am thinking clearly, I intend to destroy him. I watched him walk to the other side of the room to check a weapon rack. My side throbbed, but the pain was distant. The real problem was the glitch in my own system. I wasn't just worried about the treaty anymore. I was worried about what would happen to the engine when the governor was removed. The summit was held on neutral ground, which, in our line of work, usually meant a location that neither side could blow up without incurring significant financial penalties from the supernatural United Nations. We met in a reinforced glass conference room suspended over the river that marked the border between the Obsidian and Silver territories. It was a piece of architectural arrogance, designed to symbolize transparency, though the only thing transparent about this meeting was the Silver Alpha's contempt for me. Alpha Valerius of the Silver Pack was a man who viewed evolution as a suggestion rather than a rule. He was massive, scarred, and wore his toxic masculinity like a cheap cologne. He entered the room with an entourage of 6 guards, all posturing, all broadcasting aggression on a frequency that gave me a headache. Silas and I entered alone. It was a power move I had suggested. It implied we didn't need protection. It implied we were the threat. We took our seats. Valerius didn't sit. He leaned over the table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge, staring directly at Silas. He didn't even acknowledge my presence. To him, I was furniture, a decorative accessory with a heartbeat. I am insulted, Valerius rumbled, his voice sounding like gravel in a blender. I came to negotiate terms of surrender for your starving pack, Silas, and you bring this. He gestured vaguely in my direction with a hand the size of a shovel. I didn't know we were bringing warm bodies to the table. Is she the entertainment, or a snack for after we sign? Silas didn't react. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, and looked at me. The bond between us hummed, a low, steady frequency of amusement. He was deferring to me. He was winding me up and setting me loose. She is the lead negotiator, Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. And she speaks for the Obsidian Pack. Valerius laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. A human female, speaking for wolves? You've gone soft, Silas. The rumors were true. You're broken. Actually, I said, speaking for the first time, I didn't raise my voice. I used the tone I reserve for explaining tax code violations to toddlers. The rumors you should be paying attention to are the ones circulating among your creditors. Valerius froze. His head snapped toward me, his eyes narrowing. Speak when spoken to, meat. I tapped my tablet, projecting a holographic display into the center of the table. It wasn't a treaty. It was a balance sheet. Specifically, his balance sheet. Let's review the data, shall we? I stood up, smoothing my blazer. You're posturing about our starvation, Valerius, but according to these supply chain reports I pulled from your own logistics server, password Alpha 1, by the way, very creative, your grain silos in the eastern sector have been compromised by rot for 3 months. You've lost 40% of your winter reserves. I swiped the screen, bringing up a new graph. Red lines plummeted downward. You're currently buying grain from the southern clans at a 300% markup, I continued, pacing slowly around the table. You're financing that debt by leveraging your silver mines. But here's the kicker. The market price of silver has dropped 12% in the last quarter due to overmining in the Asian sector. You are borrowing against an asset that is depreciating faster than your approval rating. The room was silent. Valerius's guards looked uneasy. Silas watched me with the pride of a man watching a shark eat a seal. You need the shadow pass, I concluded, leaning on the table directly in front of Valerius. Not for power, for survival. If you don't get a trade route through our mountains to the western ports, your pack starves by February. You aren't here to accept our surrender, Valerius. You're here to beg for a bailout. So sit down, shut up, and sign the transit agreement. Or go home and explain to your people why they're eating snow this winter. Valerius stood there, his chest heaving. His entire worldview, that might makes right, that humans are prey, that women are silent, had just been dismantled by a spreadsheet. He looked at the data. He looked at his guards, who were looking at the floor. He looked at Silas, who was smiling. Logic had cornered him. And when you corner a beast with logic, it doesn't debate. It bites. Valerius slammed his fist onto the table, cracking the reinforced glass. The projection flickered and died. I do not negotiate with food, he roared, spit flying. And I do not recognize the authority of a bitch who hides behind paper. He turned to Silas, his eyes bleeding into the red of a challenge. He was abandoning the boardroom for the only arena he understood. You hide behind this human shield, Silas. You let her fight your battles because you are weak. I invoke the old laws. I demand the circle. I stiffened. The circle. A trial of blood, Valerius snarled, ripping his shirt open to expose his chest. To the death. Winner takes the territories, loser feeds the crows. No treaties, no lawyers, just teeth. Silas stood up slowly. The amusement was gone. The predator was back. Accepted, Silas said. Valerius pointed a trembling finger at me. And under the laws, the Luna must stand as anchor. If you fall, Silas, she is the spoil of war. The trial of blood is essentially a hostile takeover bid, stripped of the legal paperwork and conducted entirely with kinetic force. In the civilized world, when negotiations dissolve, we call in arbitration lawyers. In Silas's world, they call in the butchers. The venue shifted from the glass conference room to the pit, a subterranean amphitheater carved into the bedrock beneath the river, smelling of ancient rust and fresh adrenaline. I had 15 minutes to turn a boardroom strategy into a combat protocol. While Silas stripped off his suit jacket and unbuttoned his shirt with the grim efficiency of a man preparing for surgery, I was reviewing archived footage of Valerius's last 3 territorial disputes on my tablet. He favors his right side, I said, scrubbing through a grainy video of Valerius tearing a challenger apart in 2018. Look at the torque on his swing. He over-rotates. He had a rotator cuff tear repaired 5 years ago. It's structurally sound, but his range of motion is limited by 3 degrees. Silas paused, his shirt hanging open, revealing a torso that looked like it had been carved from marble and scarred by a lifetime of war. He looked at the screen, then at me. You are analyzing his medical history? I am analyzing his structural integrity, I corrected, stepping closer to adjust the playback speed. He's a tank, Silas. You can't trade blows with him. The mass differential is too high. You have to be the demolition crew. He guards the right shoulder subconsciously. That leaves his left flank exposed for exactly 0.4 seconds when he winds up for a heavy strike. That is your window. You don't hit him, you dismantle him. Silas didn't smile, but the gold in his eyes flared. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of my neck. His skin was burning hot, his pulse thundering against my palm where I touched his chest. "If I lose," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual arrogance, "you are the payout. That is the nature of the anchor. You stand in the ring. If I fall, you belong to him." "Then don't fall," I said, my voice steady, though my own heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "That would be a breach of contract, and I hate paperwork." We entered the arena. The noise was a physical wall, a roar of bloodlust from the gathered spectators that vibrated in the teeth. The circle was marked in crushed white chalk on the dark earth. I was positioned at the northern cardinal point, the designated anchor. I was no longer a consultant. I was the pot in a high-stakes poker game. I stood with my hands clasped behind my back, chin up, projecting an air of bored detachment that I absolutely did not feel.
Valerius entered like a gladiator, soaking in the cheers. He had stripped to the waist, revealing a landscape of muscle and tattoos. He looked at me and licked his lips. It was a gesture designed to terrify. I simply checked my imaginary watch. The referee, an ancient wolf with milky eyes, dropped his hand. The fight didn't start with a probe. It started with an explosion. Valerius launched himself across the ring, a terrifying projectile of claws and muscle. Silas met him, not with a block, but with a deflection. The impact sounded like a car crash. They moved faster than human eyes could track, a blur of violence that was less about technique and more about raw, primal dominance. Valerius fought like a sledgehammer, heavy, brutal, and relentless. He landed a blow to Silas's midsection that I felt in my own gut, a phantom impact transmitted through the bond that nearly doubled me over. I forced myself to stand straight. If I flinched, Silas would sense my fear. If he sensed fear, he would get distracted.
"The left!" I shouted over the roar of the crowd, my voice cutting through the din. "Watch the left quadrant!" Valerius roared, spinning for a backhand strike intended to decapitate. It was a move I had seen in the video. He over-rotated. His right shoulder hitched, protecting the old injury. The opening was there, a gap in the armor the size of a breath. Silas didn't hesitate. He dropped his center of gravity, sliding under the swing with impossible grace. He didn't claw. He struck with precision. A palm strike to the floating ribs on the left side, followed instantly by a sweeping kick to the knee joint. There was a sickening snap. Valerius's leg buckled. The tank had lost a tread. Silas followed the momentum, driving Valerius into the dirt. He didn't frenzy. He didn't tear. He locked Valerius's arm behind his back and applied pressure until the shoulder joint popped. It was clinical. It was efficient. It was over. The crowd went silent. Silas stood over the broken Alpha, chest heaving, blood, mostly not his own, slicking his skin. He looked at me. The bond flooded with a triumphant golden heat. He had won. The asset was secure. Valerius wheezed, tapping the ground in submission. The referee stepped in to call the match. Silas stepped back, his back to his opponent, walking toward me. "Contract fulfilled," Silas breathed, reaching for me. But my eyes were on the fallen man. I saw the shift in Valerius's posture. The submission was a feint. He wasn't reaching for the ground. He was reaching for his boot. "Silas!" I screamed, breaking protocol, breaking the stance, breaking everything. Valerius lunged, his hand flashing with dull, poisoned steel. He wasn't aiming for Silas. He was aiming for the anchor. He was aiming for me. The blade didn't hit me. It didn't hit air. It hit the only thing standing between me and a messy death, the Alpha King. Silas moved with a velocity that defied the laws of mass and momentum, placing his body directly in the path of the steel. There was a sickening, wet thud, the sound of metal piercing dense muscle, followed immediately by the acrid, chemical stench of concentrated wolfsbane. He didn't roar. He didn't strike back. His entire nervous system seized, the neurotoxin flooding his bloodstream faster than adrenaline. He collapsed, not like a hero in a movie, but like a building whose structural supports had been detonated. He hit the dirt with a weight that shook the ground beneath my feet. The arena dissolved into chaos. Valerius was tackled by the referee and 3 guards, but the damage was done. The Silver Pack was cheering. The Obsidian Pack was screaming. I did not scream. I looked at the black veins already radiating from the wound on Silas's shoulder. I looked at his eyes, rolling back, the gold consumed by a milky haze. "Secure the perimeter," I barked, my voice cutting through the panic. I didn't sound like a terrified fiancé. I sounded like a crisis manager. "Medical team, front and center. Get the extraction vehicle to the south gate. Now." A guard hesitated, looking at the fallen king, then at me. "But the Alpha. The Alpha is compromised." I grabbed the guard by his tactical vest, yanking him down to my level. "Which means I am the ranking officer on the field. Move your ass, soldier, or I will have you court-martialed before his body hits the stretcher." The logic pierced his panic. He moved. We got Silas onto a gurney. The bond on my wrist wasn't humming anymore. It was screaming, a high-pitched feedback loop of agony that nearly brought me to my knees. I blocked it out. I treated the pain as background noise, a system error to be addressed later. The ride back to the stronghold was a blur of medical machinery and failing vitals. By the time we reached the infirmary, Silas was comatose. His heart rate was dropping. The wolfsbane was shutting down his autonomic functions one by one. The doctors, shifters with degrees in trauma medicine, swarmed him, hooking him up to dialysis machines meant to filter the poison. I stood in the observation deck, watching the flatlines and the spikes. The room behind me filled up, not with well-wishers, but with vultures. The Council of Elders. 5 men who had served under Silas's father, men who viewed my presence as a temporary amusement that had turned into a liability. "He is dying," Elder Kale stated, staring at the glass. He didn't sound sad. He sounded opportunistic. "The pack cannot be leaderless. The Silver Pack will attack at dawn when they realize the king is down." "We need to mobilize the reserves," another elder said. "And we need to secure the human. She is a loose end." I turned slowly. They were already carving up the empire. They looked at me, a human woman in a blood-spattered blazer, and saw a victim. They saw a pet who had lost her master. "I am not a loose end," I said, walking to the conference table where I had left my briefcase earlier that morning. "And the pack is not leaderless." "You have no authority here, girl," Kale sneered, stepping forward. "You are a fake Luna, a contract hire. With Silas incapacitated, your contract is void." "Actually," I said, snapping the locks on the briefcase open. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I pulled out a thick document, bound in leather and stamped with the royal seal. "My contract is quite specific about this scenario." I flipped to page 42, clause 14C. I spun the document around and slammed it onto the table. "Article of incapacitation," I read, my voice cold, precise, and absolutely terrifying. "In the event that the principal is medically compromised or unable to discharge his duties, all executive authority, military command, and financial control transfers immediately to the designated proxy. That proxy is me." I looked at Kale, then at the others. I didn't flinch. "I am not the Luna," I said. "I am the regent. And until that heart monitor flatlines or he wakes up, you answer to me." "Paper burns," Kale said, flicking the heavy document with a clawed finger. "And in this room, Ms. Mercer, so do people." The threat was physical, immediate, and entirely expected. The council wasn't interested in contract law. They were interested in the power vacuum Silas had left behind. They smelled blood, and like sharks in a frenzy, they were ready to eat their own to secure the throne. But they had made a critical error in their threat assessment. They assumed that because I lacked fangs, I lacked teeth. "True," I replied, my voice echoing in the sterile silence of the observation deck. "Paper burns, but digital records are forever. And if you attempt to void this contract, Kale, I will release the encryption key to the offshore accounts where you've been funneling the widow's pension fund since 2019. Kale froze. The sneer dropped from his face, replaced by the pallor of a man realizing he was standing on a landmine. I didn't stop. I turned to the next elder. And you, Elder Vane, the security consulting fees you charge the pack for services that don't exist? I have the invoices. I have the IP addresses. I have a scheduled email set to blast this data to every pack member's phone in 5 minutes, unless I input a cancellation code. I tapped my smartwatch. 4 minutes, 50 seconds. The room shifted. The aggression didn't vanish, but the target changed. They were no longer looking at a usurper. They were looking at a liability they couldn't afford to trigger. Kale sat down. The others followed. The coup was over before it began, strangled by the red tape of their own corruption. Excellent, I said, closing the briefcase. Now get out. I have a kingdom to manage and a king to reboot. With the boardroom secured, I turned my attention to the medical crisis. The pack doctors were traditionalists, murmuring about cleansing rituals and riding out the fever. They were treating a neurotoxin with superstition. I fired them all. Get out, I ordered, pushing past a healer who was burning sage over the dialysis machine. This is chemistry, not a spiritual failing. He needs an antidote, not a seance. I pulled my phone and dialed a number I had acquired during a consulting gig for a black market pharmaceutical startup in the DMZ. The contact was a chemist named Rixa, who had lost her medical license for unethical experimentation, but possessed a genius-level understanding of supernatural toxicology. I need a synthesized wolfsbane inhibitor, I told her the moment she picked up, Class A potency, and I need it delivered to the Obsidian stronghold in 20 minutes. I'm wiring you triple your usual rate. Triple? Rixa's voice crackled over the line. For a king? Make it quadruple. And I want immunity for the transport. Done, I said. Just keep him alive. The next 6 hours were a blur of high-stakes multitasking that would have broken a lesser administrator. Rixa arrived with a syringe full of a viscous, neon-green fluid that looked like engine coolant. She injected it directly into Silas's heart. The monitors screamed, his vitals crashing before spiking violently. It was a biological reboot. While his body fought the war on the microscopic level, I fought the war on the macroeconomic level. I moved my desk into the ICU. I set up 3 monitors at the foot of his bed. The silver pack was already probing the borders, sensing weakness. I authorized a deployment of the elite guard to the southern ridge, ordering them to hold the line but not engage. I froze the Silver Alpha's assets in the central bank, citing the trial of blood violation as an act of terrorism. I drafted press releases, calmed investors, and routed supply trucks to bypass the conflict zones. I worked to the rhythm of his ventilator. The bond on my wrist was a faint, static hum, a radio station broadcasting dead air. It was terrifyingly quiet. I missed the noise. I missed the intrusive, arrogant pressure of his consciousness in the back of my mind. By 0300, the coffee in my cup was cold sludge. My eyes were burning. I had just finished negotiating a ceasefire with the neighboring clans when the sound of the ventilator changed. The rhythm hitched. I spun around in my chair. Silas was awake. He wasn't moving. He was just watching me. His eyes were clear, the milky haze of the poison gone, replaced by the familiar, burning gold. He looked at the screens surrounding his bed. He looked at the map of his territory projected on the wall, showing the secure borders. He looked at the terrified doctors standing in the corner, waiting for my orders. Then he looked at me. I was disheveled, my blazer thrown over a chair, my hair coming loose, typing furiously on a keyboard that controlled his entire empire. You, he croaked, his voice a ruin of gravel and pain. You are sitting in my chair. I'm sitting in a Herman Miller Aeron I had expensed from the logistics budget, I corrected, not stopping my typing. And I'm currently saving your kingdom from a hostile takeover while you take a nap. You're welcome. He didn't roar. He didn't demand his power back. He just watched me. And for the first time, the bond didn't feel like a chain. It felt like a circuit completing. Regent, he whispered, testing the word. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. My regent. Recovery in the supernatural sector does not involve fruit baskets or daytime television. It involves a caloric intake that would bankrupt a small catering company and a tension thick enough to trigger a Geiger counter. For 3 days, the Alpha's private ICU became my command center. Silas healed at a terrifying velocity, his metabolism knitting bone and purging toxins, while I sat at a folding table 3 feet away, dismantling his enemies via secure email. He didn't intervene. He didn't micromanage. He simply sat up in the bed, shirtless and wired to monitors that he kept trying to rip off, and watched me. His golden eyes tracked my every keystroke. It was like working under the scrutiny of a sentient, brooding weapon system. He listened as I bullied the council into submission. He watched as I rerouted the grain shipments. He observed the way his generals stopped looking at the door for him and started looking at me for orders. "You exiled Elder Kale to the perimeter patrol," Silas noted on the 3rd morning, tearing into a loaf of bread with a savagery that suggested he was imagining it was Valerius's throat. "I reassigned him based on his competency profile," I corrected, not looking up from the quarterly projections. "He enjoys barking orders and feeling important, but he lacks the cognitive flexibility for governance. The perimeter needs noise. The council room needs silence. It was an efficiency decision." "You froze the Silver Pack's assets," he continued, the low rumble of his voice vibrating through the floorboards. "Leverage," I said. "Valerius can't hire mercenaries if his credit cards are declined. I flagged his accounts for suspicious activity related to terrorism financing. It will take his lawyers 6 months to unfreeze them. By then, winter will be over." Silas swung his legs over the side of the bed. The monitors beeped a frantic protest, which he silenced by simply crushing the sensor clamped to his finger. He stood up, steady on his feet for the first time since the arena. He walked to my desk, placing his hands on the surface and leaning in until he consumed my entire field of vision. The smell of him, antiseptic, ozone, and raw power, flooded my senses. The bond on my wrist flared hot, a biological acknowledgement of his proximity. "You enjoy it," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. The power, the control. You sit in that chair, Sloan, and you don't look like a consultant. You look like a queen who finally found a kingdom worth breaking. I stopped typing. I looked at his hands. Scarred, lethal, capable of snapping a neck as easily as a pencil. And then up at his face. This was the test. He wasn't asking about my job satisfaction. He was checking to see if the regent intended to become a usurper. In his world, power was never shared. It was seized. "I enjoy competence, Silas," I replied, keeping my voice clinically cool despite the sudden acceleration of my heart rate. "I enjoy systems that function. Your kingdom was a mess of ego, bad bookkeeping, and testosterone-fueled decision-making. I didn't fix it because I want to rule it. I fixed it because I cannot abide a disorganized spreadsheet." I stood up, closing the laptop with a definitive snap that echoed in the quiet room. And frankly, the hours are terrible. The hazard pay doesn't cover the stress of managing a council that still thinks the earth is flat. I prefer contracts with clear exit clauses. He studied me, the bond between us vibrating with a complex frequency, suspicion mixing with something darker, something possessive. He was looking for the lie. He was looking for the ambition that would justify him treating me as a threat. But all he found was professional detachment. "So you are just clocking out?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "The Silver Alpha is neutralized," I listed, ticking off the contract deliverables on my fingers. "The treaty creates a trade route that solves your famine issue. The internal trader has been excavated from a foundation. My scope of work is complete." I walked to the closet where my garment bag hung, putting distance between us. Clause 19, termination upon completion of objectives. The objective is complete. I am initiating the exit protocol. I expected him to argue. I expected a growl, a command, a physical barrier blocking the door. I expected the wolf to demand I stay. Instead, he went silent. The bond went cold, not severed, but walled off. He withdrew the emotional feed, leaving me with just my own pulse thudding in my ears. "Pack your bags then," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the heat that had been there seconds ago. "I will have a car ready in the hour. We wouldn't want to keep you from your next client." It was a dismissal, a reassertion of the hierarchy. He was the king, I was the help.
I felt a sharp, illogical pang in my chest, a glitch in my own emotional regulation, but I suppressed it. I packed with military precision. Fold, tuck, zip. Every item placed in the suitcase was a brick in the wall I was rebuilding between us. I was Sloan Mercer, elite consultant. I did not get attached to the assets. I did not mourn the end of a job. I walked out of the stronghold without looking back. The contract was fulfilled. The invoice was sent. So why did the silence in the car feel louder than the war I had just won? The private airstrip was a desolate stretch of cracked tarmac under a slate-gray sky, located 10 miles outside the Pack's territorial border. It was the kind of place where money changed hands in briefcases and cargo was loaded without manifests. I stood by the steps of the Gulfstream jet that was my ticket back to the civilized world of glass skyscrapers and non-lethal corporate disputes. The turbine engines were already whining, a high-pitched scream that should have drowned out everything else. But it couldn't drown out the noise in my own blood. Leaving the stronghold didn't feel like a departure. It felt like a biological amputation. The further I moved from the epicenter of the Pack, the more the mark on my wrist throbbed. It wasn't pain exactly. It was a phantom limb sensation, a stretching of a connective tissue that shouldn't have existed. My heart rate was elevated, my skin felt cold, and my focus was fragmented. I categorized the symptoms as withdrawal. I was detoxing from a high concentration exposure to supernatural adrenaline. I told myself that once I was in the air, cruising at 40,000 feet, the signal would degrade and I would regain my equilibrium. I gripped the handle of my Toomey suitcase, treating it like an anchor to my old life, and signaled the pilot to prepare for boarding. I didn't hear the vehicle approach. I felt it. The bond on my wrist flared, a sudden spike of proximity that hit my nervous system before the sound of the engine reached my ears. A black armored SUV breached the perimeter fence, tearing through the chain link as if it were spun sugar. It didn't drive. It hunted. The vehicle skidded onto the runway, tires screaming against the asphalt, drifting sideways to block the jet's taxi path. The pilot killed the engines immediately. The sudden silence on the tarmac was heavy, pressurized by the sheer aggression of the maneuver. The driver's door opened. Silas stepped out. He looked like a ruin. He wasn't wearing the tailored suits of a king or the tactical gear of a soldier. He was in jeans and a torn t-shirt, his feet bare against the freezing tarmac. He looked like he had dismantled a wall to get here. He walked toward me, ignoring the pilot, ignoring the security protocols, ignoring the laws of aviation. He stopped 10 feet away. The bond snapped back into place, the ache vanishing instantly, replaced by a hum of satisfaction that made my knees weak. I hated it. I hated the efficiency of it. "You blocked a federally regulated flight path," I stated, my voice fighting the wind. "That is a felony, Silas. Even for a sovereign head of state. You are creating a jurisdictional nightmare." "I don't care about the jurisdiction," he growled, his voice rough, scraping against the air. "You left a variable unaccounted for." "I balanced the books," I countered, refusing to back down, refusing to let him see that my hands were shaking. "I secured the borders. I neutralized the threat. The contract is closed. The invoice is in your inbox." "The external threats are neutralized," he admitted, stepping closer. He invaded my personal space, bringing with him the scent of pine, ozone, and desperation. "But the internal system is failing. I sat in that office for 1 hour after you left. The silence was catastrophic. I looked at the spreadsheets, and they were just numbers. I looked at the map, and it was just geography. I lost the pattern, Sloan." He wasn't pleading for affection. He knew better than to insult me with sentiment. He was making a business case. He was pitching a merger. "I am pure instinct," he continued, his golden eyes locking onto mine with terrifying intensity. "I am force and violence and territory. That is what keeps them safe. But it is not what makes them thrive. You are the logic. You are the structure. You are the governor on the engine. Without you, I am just a warlord sitting on a pile of gold I don't know how to spend." He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between us, heat radiating from his palm.
I cannot run this empire efficiently without you. The bond, it stabilizes the wolf. It quiets the noise. If you leave, the efficiency rating of my leadership drops to 0. You want to talk about waste? That is waste. It was the most compelling argument he could have made. He didn't want a wife to warm his bed. He wanted a co-executive to run his world. He acknowledged that my competence was the missing component in his survival strategy. He was offering me the one thing I had spent my entire career chasing, the position of being absolutely, undeniably essential. I looked at the jet, the symbol of my safe, predictable, lonely life. Then I looked at the man who had just committed a felony to offer me a job. The logic was sound. The pay was terrible, the hazards were lethal, but the optimization potential? Infinite. I'm not staying as a fake fiancé, I said, letting go of my suitcase. The handle clicked as it hit the tarmac. And I'm not staying as a consultant. I'm done with hourly rates. Name your terms, he said immediately. The relief in his eyes was almost blinding. I want a new contract, I told him, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat of his skin. And this time, we negotiate equity. Equity, I said, my voice cutting through the wind that swept across the desolate tarmac. I'm not talking about a joint checking account, Silas. I'm talking about operational control. 50% voting rights on all pack decisions, veto power on military incursions, and absolutely 0 obeying. If you use the alpha voice on me, I file for immediate dissolution of the partnership. I am not a subordinate. I am a co-signatory. He didn't flinch. He didn't bristle at the challenge to his authority. Instead, he watched me with a terrifying intensity, analyzing the terms. Co-governance, he mused, tasting the word like a rare vintage. The council will hate it. They believe power is a zero-sum game. The council hates anything that prevents them from embezzling, I countered, crossing my arms. I don't care about their traditionalist feelings. I care about the bottom line. Do we have a deal, or do I get on that plane? Silas looked at me. For a moment, the silence stretched, heavy and pressurized. Then he moved. He didn't sign a paper. He didn't shake my hand. He dropped to one knee on the asphalt. The sight of a 7-foot apex predator kneeling is jarring. It violates the natural order. Alphas do not kneel. They break things until other people kneel. But Silas wasn't submitting. He wasn't showing weakness. He was acknowledging a superior asset. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with a reverence that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with respect for competence. He recognized that my brain was the deadliest weapon in his arsenal, and he was treating it with the appropriate gravity. I don't need a Luna to look pretty at galas, he said, his voice rough with absolute honesty. I need a queen who can balance the ledger while the world burns. You are the only thing that makes this crown heavy enough to be worth wearing. He took my hand, turning it over to expose the wrist where the temporary mark was fading, a contract expiring. I accept the terms. Full equity, dual command. The wolf serves the logic, until the system fails. Then seal it, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of anticipation for the upgrade. Upload the patch. He lowered his head and bit down. The first time, it had been a pinch, a temporary tag to fool a lawyer. This was different. This was a rewriting of the source code. The pain was sharp, immediate, and then instantly replaced by a flood of data. It wasn't a wave of sappy emotion. It was a sudden, terrifying expansion of awareness. I gasped, gripping his shoulders as the network connection went live. I didn't just feel him. I felt the pack. I felt the guards on the perimeter 3 miles away. I felt the fear of the council members in the stronghold. I felt the structural integrity of the entire organization. It was like being given root access to a supercomputer after years of working on a limited terminal. The chaos of his mind, the wolf, the rage, the instinct, flowed into mine, and my mind, the logic, the order, the strategy, flowed into his. We didn't merge into one person. We became a dual-core processor. The friction was gone. The noise was gone. The system was finally balanced. He stood up, wiping a drop of blood from his lip. The wound on my wrist was already sealing. leaving behind a silver scar that looked less like a bite and more like a circuit board trace. "Report," he said, his voice steady, the growl replaced by a calm resonance. I blinked, processing the new telemetry streaming directly into my cortex. Heart rates are elevated across the sector. Morale is stabilizing. And you? I looked at him, seeing not just the man, but the biological imperative driving him. You are calm. I am optimized, he corrected. He opened the door of the SUV, waiting for me to enter. The contract is permanent, Sloan. No exit clauses, no severance packages. I don't need an exit clause, I said, climbing into the passenger seat and immediately pulling up the Pack's org chart on my phone to begin the restructuring. I have tenure. 6 months into the new fiscal year, the Obsidian Pack wasn't just solvent, we were a case study in aggressive restructuring. We had diversified into private security contracting and high-frequency trading, leveraging the heightened reflexes of the wolf for sub-second algorithmic advantages. The stronghold no longer smelled like wet dog and desperation. It smelled like espresso, ozone, and compounding interest. The division of labor was absolute. Silas handled the kinetic enforcement, the hardware. If a rogue pack tried to breach the perimeter, or a syndicate tried to muscle in on our shipping lanes, he reminded them why apex predators don't negotiate with food. I handled the geopolitical strategy, the software. I navigated the treaties, the trade embargoes, and the internal audits that kept the council terrified of making a rounding error. We were in the executive suite, the morning sun hitting the bulletproof glass. Silas walked in, not with a severed head, but with a double-shot latte, specific to my caffeine tolerance. He placed it on my desk, his hand lingering near mine. The bond hummed, a steady background efficiency that kept us synchronized better than any fiber optic cable. The Southern clans are mobilizing, he noted, leaning against the window, watching the horizon with that deceptive stillness. They want to challenge the new trade tariffs. They view the tax hike as a declaration of war. I didn't look up from my tablet. Let them. I already purchased their municipal debt yesterday afternoon through a shell company in Zurich. If they cross the border, I foreclose on their ancestral lands before they take a single step. It's cleaner than a battlefield. Silas smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew he never had to worry about logistics again. He adjusted his cuffs, the predator perfectly concealed in bespoke wool. I stood up and straightened his tie, not as a doting wife, but as a campaign manager, ensuring the candidate looked the part. We have a meeting with their envoys at noon, I said, checking the schedule. Try not to growl unless they use the wrong tax forms. No promises, he replied. The intercom buzzed. A new crisis, a new variable. Most people would panic. I just opened a new spreadsheet. I had a formula for that. The treaty was never the endgame. It was just the initial buy-in. I didn't just negotiate a peace deal. I negotiated a reality where intelligence is the ultimate leverage and biology bows to strategy. If you believe that competence is the most attractive trait in a partner, hit that subscribe button to enter the executive inner circle. The door clicked shut behind us. Do not disturb, flashing in red.